So we were talking about how very often the ordinary person is way ahead of the political class in Washington, political leadership. And we're talking about how Harry Truman was moved to support civil rights measures because basically it was a political calculus. Black voters suddenly became important outside of the South. In the South, they were still largely disenfranchised, but in the rest of the country, they mattered and they could swing elections. And so the Democratic Party, which began a transformation on racial issues, transforms on those issues, becomes more supportive of civil rights out of self-survival in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, meanwhile, you had individual African Americans breaking down barriers in sports, as I said, in entertainment, and we also had the civil rights groups really accelerated their resistance, and they began to win some important victories. During a 1950 NAACP legal strategy session, lawyers decided to challenge public school segregation head-on. And as I said before, an earlier NAACP approach had been to accept the terms of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision to basically make the separate, segregated accommodations provided black people equal as the Plessy decision mandated. But now they're going to challenge Plessy more directly. And so the Civil Rights Organization, the NAACP, is going to represent African American parents who filed lawsuits in several school districts in Delaware, Kansas, Louisiana, South Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. These suits reach the Supreme Court in 1952. They go through the federal court system, and the Supreme Court decides to consolidate all the cases together. They're going to decide them together as one decision. Under the title Brown et al. Versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Now, the court announces its decision on May 17, 1954. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. His name is Earl Warren. Eisenhower will regret that decision. He'll say it's the biggest damn fool decision I ever made, appointing Warren to the court. Warren is going to be a huge force on the court for extending civil rights to African Americans, voting rights, free speech rights, rights of prisoners for the next, in the 50s and the 60s. He's going to be a major force in transforming American law. And he didn't hear the initial arguments. Then they have a rehearing, and he gets the justices together, and he said, this is such a fundamental decision. We're going to have a strong majority. This has to have the force of the court strongly supporting what we decide here. And they write one of the most significant and positive Supreme Court decisions ever in overturning the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which said that segregation was constitutional provided accommodations were equal. Earl Warren writes this, writing the majority opinion. He writes, quote, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now, here's the problem. The Supreme Court in that 1954 decision didn't lay out specifically the pace or the means of desegregation and how the court would, or what an acceptable definition of desegregation would be. And that was real unfortunate. It's going to allow the desegregation battles to continue for 5 decades or more. The Dallas school desegregation case, Tasby versus Estes, lasts 4 decades. They issue a implementation order May 31st, 1955. It's frequently known as Brown 2. And they simply direct the school districts to achieve integration with, quote, all deliberate speed. And as many people have pointed out, deliberate can mean intentional, but it can also mean slowly, carefully. And so the southern states are going to really exploit that linguistic trap. And the Supreme Court also provides a list of reasons why school districts could use, to delay integration, such as administrative difficulties. So that's a giant loophole that's really going to undermine the power of Brown. And also, they're going to give, not intentionally, I don't think, opposition to desegregation to organize what comes to be known as massive resistance. These delays are going to allow integration opponents to whip up fear and resentment. And in July 1954, plantation manager Robert P. Patterson organizes the first White Citizens Council in Sunflower County, Mississippi. NAACP attorney, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, is going to call these groups the White Citizens Councils, the Uptown Klan. And these organizations are going to draw segregationist lawyers, doctors, bankers, merchants, and other influential citizens. The Klan at this point is small and is drawn up with people who generally are not very well educated, who are not particularly prosperous. The White Citizens Council is where the rich people, the powerful people, influential people, or racist go. And they're going to use legal and illegal methods to prevent enforcement of Brown. So let me just show you a couple of illustrations here real quickly. These are the three NAACP attorneys who won the Brown case. This is them celebrating the decision outside of the Supreme Court building. George Hayes, Thurgood Marshall is in the middle. As I said, he will become the first African-American Supreme Court Justice appointed by Lyndon Johnson. And then James Nabrett. And they're celebrating here their victory in the first Brown decision. Now, this is a collection of White Citizens Council buttons from Jackson, Mississippi in the 1950s. Please note this Confederate battle flag. That anyone who tries to tell you that symbol is not a racist symbol, or all the symbols of the Confederacy are not racist, racists constantly embrace that symbol as they pursue their white supremacist agenda. The word never here means we're never going to accept integration of schools or any other public accommodations. And so these groups, these White Citizens Councils, are going to use their financial and political influence to minimize integration or try to stop it. So for instance, African Americans who file integration lawsuits will get fired from their jobs. And they could find no further employment in those counties because they get basically put on a blacklist. They tell, don't hire this person. These groups are going to raise millions of dollars to establish what are called white academies. And by the way, these are private schools. By the way, in the 1980s, 1990s, a lot of conservatives are going to be upset because of the new focus in education on evolution, acknowledging civil rights movements, roles in history, criticism of the South during the Civil War gets taught sometimes in public schools. And by the way, as in the 90s and later on, when they begin to teach a little bit about LGBTQ people and their history, conservatives get very upset. And they go to private academies, and then they ask legislatures to fund them, even though these are private schools. They want public money. And they call for things called school vouchers. It descends from these white segregationist academies. And by the way, TV preachers who become famous later are part of the anti-gay movement, anti-women's rights movements like Jerry Falwell, opened segregation academies in this period. Now, at the movement's peak, White Citizens Councils claim 1 million members across the South. Meanwhile, state legislatures also try to block implementation. Faced with integration orders, school officials in Little Rock, Arkansas, and Norfolk, Virginia completely shut down their public schools. We're not going to teach anyone. And so, that happens, the attempt to integrate Little Rock High School, by the way. And by the way, Bill Clinton was a student in the Little Rock schools at that time. becomes really difficult, harsh, and the first African-American students who go to those schools are harassed. One black girl who ends up going to Little Rock High School has acid thrown in her face. You know, just really ugly retaliation. Norfolk, Virginia closes their schools completely. Prince Edward County, Virginia also does it. It does it for 8 years. There's no public education in those schools because they'd rather have no schools than have schools with black students. Some southern states, as I said, provide white parents, and it's white parents, vouchers, payments to go pay the tuition at private schools rather than have public education. Now, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, had long planned to challenge segregated seating on the city's buses. Black riders were made to sit in the back. We've talked about this before. And each bus had a moving barrier to accommodate white riders, to expand when more white riders get on the bus. Black people had to move back, and if black seats were too crowded to accommodate anyone else, they had to stand. If there was no room in the black section, well, too bad. The next rider had to wait for the next bus. Well, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, who was the secretary of the local NAACP branch, left her job as a seamstress at a Montgomery Fair department store. I mean, she's just going home for the day. She's not quitting. And she enters a bus that takes her home each day. A white man stood at the front of the bus, and the driver, J.P. Blake, ordered when this white man entered, all the black passengers to move back just behind the white section to expand the white seating. African American passengers don't budge. After a threat from Blake, 3 of the riders relented. They moved. Parks said, "No, I'm not going to do it." She remained seating. He replied that Blake did, the bus driver, he had the authority to determine where the white section ended, and he had the authority to have Parks arrested. If she refused to move, she's going to be arrested. Parks is going to be arrested. She remains seated until Blake returns with Montgomery police officers. They fingerprint her and put her in jail, and she's charged with violating the city's segregation laws. Here's a picture of her being fingerprinted for taking a whites only seat. These actions were defined as crimes. Well, this is going to kick off one of the most important waves of protest in American history, one that has deep implications for every decade that follows. So the African American community had all experienced the humiliation of coping with the city's Jim Crow ordinances. So they quickly mobilize as word spreads of Parks' arrest, and a group is formed, the Montgomery Improvement Association, which is going to lead a boycott of the city bus system, and the leader of that group is a little-known Baptist preacher, 26 years old, Martin Luther King Jr. He's going to be president of the association. A one-day black boycott of the city's transit system turns into a year-long campaign. In spite of the poverty of the supporters, the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, raises $2,000 a week to establish and continue and pay for gasoline for carpools. Black people pick up other black people to drive them to the homes they work as maids, or the drugstores where they're janitors, or any other job they have. So they rely on that. And by the way, the city police began to pull over cars with multiple black riders, and sometimes arrest people for driving black people to their jobs. You have the organization raise money to pay legal expenses and other costs associated with the protest. By the February of 1956, the story made headlines around the world, and donations began to pour in even from other countries. The boycott ends up lasting 381 days, and it begins to, and this is often when change happens, it begins to hurt Montgomery business, white-owned businesses, their bottom line financially. A federal court in June 1956 rules that Alabama's and Montgomery's bus segregation laws violates the U.S. Constitution. A decision affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court in its Browder versus Gale decision. Even though segregated transportation remains the rule in the South after this period for years to come, this is important because it's a crack in the segregation laws, a crack in the enforcement of those laws in Montgomery, and it makes Martin Luther King a national figure for the first time. And other cities, such as Tallahassee, Baton Rouge, are going to witness similar bus boycotts. Now, very often, as we transition to the 60s, leadership of the movement is going to pass to younger people, college students your age. And we're going to see this with the sit-in movements, the sit-in protest that spread across the country, actually starting in 1960, February 1960, 4 months before I'm born. Young people are sick of the slow pace of change after court decisions. And by 1959, 5 years after the Brown decision, 99% of black students in the South still attend segregated schools. 99%. So tired of this, tired of their terrible treatment when they go to buy something at a drugstore, try to buy clothes in a clothing store if it's owned by white people. In Dallas, for instance, the downtown department stores like Neiman Marcus had a rule that if a black woman simply touched a dress or another article of clothing, she had to buy it. Because anything touched by a black person automatically became something no white person would want to deal with it. And of course, that would be tremendously expensive. They humiliated black customers even when they were spending money there. Well, college students get tired of this. And so 4 African American students on February 1st, 1960, their names are, you see them in the picture there, they're in Greensboro, North Carolina. They go to North Carolina A&T College. Azell Blair, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and J.R. David Richmond, and a white NAACP member, Ralph Johns, together plan to strike a blow at integration by intentionally violating the laws. Rather than filing a lawsuit, they're going to break the laws and force this community to enforce a law that's unjust and let the world judge that community. So they stage what's called a sit-in at the segregated lunch counter at the town's F.W. Woolworth Company department store. The 5 protesters sit at the lunch counter for hours, waiting to be served. Some white customers assume the students don't know any better, tell them that, oh, wait a minute, it's a whites only counter, you're not supposed to sit here. Of course, these students know exactly that. A small number curse them, and there are a tiny number of white people who actually pat them on the back and wish them well. Now, the protesters are going to prove much harder to ignore the next day. 25 participate in the second sit-in. On the third day, 85 show up. So this grows. The 4th day of the sit-ins involves white college students from the University of California's Women's College in Greensboro, in North Carolina. Soon, we have North Carolina students basically staging sit-ins at theaters, drugstores, other businesses in a dozen towns across the state. North Carolina becomes the epicenter of this movement, and then it spreads to other states. Sit-ins bedevil Jim Crow businesses in Hampton, Virginia, Chattanooga, Nashville, Tennessee. And on the 7th day of this campaign, that has gone, as they say today, viral, demonstrators have 54 sit-ins in 15 cities and 9 states across the former Confederacy. Eventually, 70,000 Americans, white and black Americans, are going to participate in these sit-ins in 1960. 3,000 are going to be arrested, And the demonstrations, by the way, are not just in the South, because as we've said before, segregation is not only a Southern thing. There's de facto segregation. In fact, there's legal segregation, de jure segregation in states outside the South. There are sit-ins in Nevada. That's how widespread the practice is. Now, the first sit-in is basically spontaneous. Eventually, these demonstrations become more organized, and students begin to get training to prepare, because whites react to this violently. And actually, this is an interesting tactic. That's part of the strategy. Because of something I mentioned in an earlier lecture, there's television. And television can carry pictures of white people attacking black people. And it changes the image of whites and blacks. Whites are the thugs, the violent people, the lawless people. African Americans sitting in their ties and their button-down shirts and sitting politely, waiting to be served, and getting pulled off counters or pulled off stools, kicked while the cameras are rolling, and then that gets broadcast on the TV news. That changes the moral equation and the perception of what's right and wrong for a lot of viewers. So to accomplish this, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders began to train students on how to behave nonviolently and maintain the calm and the discipline to not fight back during this. Over Easter weekend 1960, African Americans are going to get this training, and they're going to form a new group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that commonly is known as SNCC. That's what they refer to it after the initials, SNCC. So as it spreads, and you get the footage, like in Nashville, angry local whites taking cigarettes, and if there's an exposed back, like a black woman's wearing a dress, and they put the cigarette against her skin while she's sitting there. If you have a police blasting protesters who are protesting integration with fire hoses, where the acceleration of the water is fast enough that skin tears off, they're knocked to the ground. Sometimes these are children. You have police dogs attacking protesters, often young people. You have ketchup and mustard and flour poured on the hair of these protesters. It has a profound impact on newspaper coverage, magazine coverage, television coverage, and you begin to have African Americans who have been ignored in their struggles for liberation since Reconstruction suddenly getting a sympathetic audience in areas outside the South. And in the North, blacks and whites organize boycotts of chain stores that practice segregation in the South. These are national store chains. So they have stores in the North, they let black customers in, but their Southern stores don't. So you have boycotts of Walgreens, Woolworths, S.H. Kress, and other of these stores. Sometimes one Miss America participates in the protests. You have celebrities participating. And that puts pressure on those corporations who sell across the nation. Their image is being affected by what their affiliates or stores are doing in the South. Now we have a new president in 1961 who actually, there was a moment in the 1960 campaign where Martin Luther King gets arrested. He's thrown into prison. There's deep concern that King will not survive his time in the prison. Coretta Scott King makes contact with the Kennedy campaign. Kennedy's just running for president against the Vice President Richard Nixon. He's not president yet. Mrs. King asks the Kennedy campaign if they can do something to get Martin Luther King out of jail. And Bobby Kennedy gets on the phone. He's running his brother John's campaign, basically. He's his closest political confidant. And Bobby Kennedy arranges for King to be released. By the way, Coretta Scott King had also contacted Nixon, who in the Senate had actually backed some civil rights bills. And Nixon doesn't want to offend any Southern voters, so they sort of ignore him. So when King is released, Martin Luther King is released, Martin's father, known to everyone as Daddy King, Martin Sr., publicly endorses John Kennedy. And some people feel like that was the factor in states like Michigan, etc., that allowed John Kennedy to beat Richard Nixon for the presidency. It was a razor-thin margin in the popular vote. Now, he's not really all that interested in civil rights. He's not opposed to it, but it's not a cause of his. And when he becomes president, he has to deal with a Democratic caucus in the South, and the House and Senate. And remember, back then, the segregationist Democrats won every election in the South in that era. And so that means they had seniority in both the House and Senate. Those House members and the Senate members, they were the chairs of all the committees that decided whether or not any bills the Kennedy administration introduced would advance. They could kill any legislation. Kennedy didn't want to offend them. And he was having trouble getting bills passed. And so that he got frustrated. He became obsessed with foreign relations. What was going on in Cuba? He tried to overthrow the communist government in Cuba. He was worried about the Soviet Union. He didn't want to deal with civil rights. It was messy. He saw it as a no-win situation. He'd lose voters either way. One point, he has someone driving him through Washington, D.C. He sees a man named Harris Wofford, who becomes his chief civil rights advisor. He has the driver pull the car over. He has Wofford get in the car. He says, okay, 5 minutes, tell me about the civil rights thing. This is not a situation where he's going to devote a lot of deep attention or study. But nevertheless, African Americans aren't going to submit to the Kennedy agenda. They're not going to wait to serve him. They've got to fight for their rights. So you have recent federal court orders mandating desegregation of interstate transportation terminals where people go to wait for their buses. But separate white and black sections still survived in spite of that court order in the South. In the spring of 1961, James Farmer, executive director of the Congress of Racial Equality, announces that black and white freedom rides would test the willingness of the federal courts and the federal government to enforce the law, to enforce decisions that had already been made. And they're going to do it by having white and black civil rights workers board buses together and sit in segregated sections together, breaking the racial boundaries set by Jim Crow laws. It begins in Washington, D.C., May 1961. That's when the first black and white freedom riders board buses. And they they start in Washington, D.C., they head to the Deep South. They head to Georgia. They head to Alabama. They head to Mississippi. Some of the participants become famous, particularly a future congressman from Georgia, John Lewis, who at one stop is going to get clubbed and beaten. The buses have tires slashed. You have buses set on fire or bombed. We have an illustration here of this. Here's John Kennedy, by the way, if you weren't familiar with him, who, as I said, is the second youngest American president. Teddy Roosevelt being the youngest to ever achieve the White House. Here's what happens to one bus, one Greyhound bus, at a stop. As I recall, that's in Anniston, Alabama, I believe. Yes. This is a common type of reaction. What happens is eventually the Greyhound bus drivers say they're not going to drive buses with freedom riders anymore because they feel like their lives are in danger. Well, by that point, John Kennedy's brother, Bobby, is the Attorney General of the United States. And by the way, after that happens, after the president appoints his brother to the cabinet, a nepotism law is passed prohibiting presidents from appointing their relatives to cabinet positions. But anyway, Bobby Kennedy calls the Greyhound company superintendent, and he says, you have to comply with court decisions. Now in Montgomery, Alabama, when the riders step out of the free Greyhound bus, there's a mob at the terminal. They shout, and I apologize for the language, but again, I don't want to make segregationists and racists look better. They shout, "Niggers, kill the niggers." A mob attacks an NBC television crew filming the event. They smash him in the head and his equipment, and they beat him until he passes out. You know, we're going to have people who get spinal injuries from their attacks on, and people who die during these melees. So that's going to cause shock, and again, it's going to provoke sympathy, and it's certain that the freedom rides are going to continue. So reluctantly, again, the Kennedy administration is being dragged by the public. They're not taking leadership here. They're following the movements. They're responding to the movements. Why? Because those images go out to the rest of the world. And the United States is trying to tell all these newly free nations in Africa, Asia, etc., we represent freedom. The Soviet Union represents dictatorship. And you know, they're communists. They don't believe in free speech, free assembly. And now people can see what happens if a black person tries to sit on a bus seat. And he knows it's hurting the U.S. image. And one thing that's interesting, Martin Luther King was willing to embarrass Democratic presidents to get them to do what he wanted to do the right thing. And so the Kennedy brothers were often furious with King. And there's a very contentious relationship. But Robert Kennedy prods the Interstate Commerce Commission and pressures the operators of the bus terminals to take down across the South the signs that said whites only. The civil rights movement will continue. John Kennedy will be murdered in Dallas in 1963. And a surprising political, sometimes ally of the civil rights movement will come to power, a Texan named Lyndon Johnson. We'll talk about that next time.